This is Monica Perez. Thank you so much for joining me today. We are here with another installment of our reading and conversation around Makers of the Modern Mind, the book by Thomas P. Neal. Today we're beginning the chapter on Locke. So we did Luther, we did Calvin, we did Descartes, and now we're doing Locke. So I'm super excited to do this. I do not, my flagship show is not these books. It's really deep dives and newsreels and all of that. But given my status as a displaced person, it's been a little tricky to keep my eye on the news or anything other than my immediate situation. So now I'm in an Airbnb. My house is totally toxified, which I did not take seriously. So the electricity came on, the gas came on, everything came, water is running. So I just started going up there and trying to clean, like not to where we have to wait for the insurance guy to come. Anyway, yesterday the neighbor came in and was like, "Are you just walking around here without a mask on?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I don't do masks." Well, he's like, "It's toxic." I said, "Well, I breathed in, all of us breathed in enough smoke a couple of weeks ago. I think whatever, we're pretty much covered as far as toxic inhalations." Anyway, I woke up this morning totally like my body's like, "Oh my gosh, there's toxins in there." And this keeps happening every time we go in, or when we did the smoke, and even now, every one of us like kind of felt like I had a cold the next day, which to me is a little bit of that kind of a combination of miasma theory and terrain theory. So there's something in the air and everybody gets sick because your body wants to expel it. And it feels like it's a contagion. Well, she got a cold, but it feels like a cold, but I know it's going to go away in a couple of days. So I'm not too worried about it, but I'm not going to hang out at the house until we get until at least I'm free to put air purifiers up. They want you to like leave it in place so they can assess the damage and whatever. I don't know. It's very annoying. But they've been doing a good job up there getting that. I cannot believe they got the power on and within 2 weeks because all the lines were down. Anyway, I was down. I was a little depressed there for a while, and it doesn't because other people are in much worse shape. You feel bad, like even feeling sorry for yourself. And then I just said, you know what, you just got work to do. You just gotta keep going. And I do really feel bad for the people who lost everything, but I'm just going to live in gratitude that I didn't and whatever. And thank you very much to everybody who donated to keep me going this month. As I said, I'm not desperate for cash, but I'm not going to do enough shows to cover kind of my costs. And I didn't want to tap into the, savings. We're doing that already. And so people gave me enough to get through the month. So very much appreciated. If anybody wants to pitch in a little more, I wouldn't say no. It's on my website, monicaperezshow.com. There's a donate button. And another way to support the show going forward is Parallel Mike Hivore and I are having a Zoom call for premium subscribers on Thursday, January 23rd at 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern. And if you want to join that Zoom call, I'll answer any questions you want about what's been going on with me. And those guys still have their finger on the pulse of what's going on in the world. You can join my Substack, Monica Perez Show Substack. And I have a 90-day free trial going. So you can check it out, try the show, commercial free, try to Zoom call. There's a little bit of premium content there. And without further ado, though I didn't, without further ado, let us get on with the show. Does this sound a little loud? I really don't know how to turn down the volume of the output. Maybe I'll give it a shot here. I think I'm having complaints that my mic's too loud, although it should be auto. It should be auto. Let me see if I can fix it on auto. Audio, reduce mic, blah, 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 blah. Here you go. That's going to do it. How do you like that? Much better. All right. Well, that's the end of that. I hate giving preemptive stuff on a book reading, but this is my only way to communicate right now because I just cannot spend an entire day to like prep real news. And I'm pretty fascinated with this book, to be honest. I did read it once before, but I always think this with philosophy, the older you get, the better you understand it. So let's dig into Locke. And Locke is somebody where if you asked when I was growing up, Locke was for the kind of conservative libertarian types and Rousseau is for the more socialist types. So let's see if that checks out in this guy's estimation. I don't think this guy's going to like him because although he's Catholic, he has like this the author, Thomas Neal, seems to inform his opinions about this stuff on a kind of Catholic moral level. And we are all, I think about really strictly separating church and state, but I think he thinks that's an element of the modern mind. So let's see what he says about Locke. So this is chapter 5 in the book, Locke, Common Sense and Compromise, it's called. John Locke is the typical English thinker of modern times. There have been more profound and more consistent English philosophers, but none quite so English as Locke. Let's see. Where Descartes was thoroughly French and did much to fix the French way of thinking, Locke appealed to the Englishman's common sense as the ultimate authority in philosophy and in action. Descartes' standard of truth was the clear and distinct idea, but Locke, feeling that clear and distinct ideas can be false, asks for things to be consistent with common sense. Descartes required the certitude of evidence and tried to resolve everything into mathematical formulas. Locke looked only for probability as his guide in all things. Descartes had tried to build an integrated system of philosophy which was to be consistent, complete, perfect. Locke tried only to solve individual practical problems as they arose by dissolving them in the solvent of common sense, and he apparently never bothered whether one solution neutralized or contradicted another. Except for their importance, Descartes and Locke seem to have had only one thing in common. They were both bachelors throughout life. But symbolically, they were bachelors for different reasons. Descartes found woman's beauty dim beside that of truth. Locke was too concerned with himself, and especially his health, to consider marriage. My health, he wrote from Paris to a friend in England, is the only mistress I have a long time courted, and is so coy a one that I think it will take up the remainder of my days to obtain her good graces and keep her in good humor. It did, for 72 years. Of the two, Locke was undoubtedly the more humane, the more friendly and likable. One Descartes' side is nobleness, integrity, high pride. On Locke's side is affableness, adaptability, a measure of humility. Descartes and Locke both made significant contributions to the development of the modern mind, and herein lies their largest common denominator. Locke, were he here now, would be genuinely surprised to find himself so important. Descartes, on the other hand, would be jealous, and only grudgingly would he inch over to make room for the Englishman. And Locke would rightly be surprised, for, as one of his biographers aptly remarks, his importance seems in excess of the author's speculative depth and subtlety or grandeur of character. But through accidents of time and circumstance over which he had no control, Locke, who was not a philosopher at all, that's what I was thinking, became one of the big three in the history of modern philosophy. I mean, Locke, of all people, I think had the greatest influence on our kind of laissez-faire economics. And as much as I love that as a libertarian, I also realize that to some extent that stuff is a plot. If you guys are interested, maybe I'll tell you a little bit about the Millet conversation I had with James yesterday at the end of the show. And the Argentine guy, and I think he's exploiting libertarian ideas and will ultimately discredit them. Anyway, George Santayana does not overstate the case when he observes of Locke, father of psychology, father of the criticism of knowledge, father of theoretical liberalism, which is libertarianism in this context, godfather at least of the American political system, of Voltaire and the Encyclopedia. At home, he was the ancestor of that whole school of polite, moderate opinion, which can unite liberal Christianity with mechanical science and with psychological idealism. Locke is important for having rescued philosophy from the ivory-towered retreats where Descartes and his successors had imprisoned her. Locke brought her back into the parlor, the counting house, and the pub. The third Earl of Shaftesbury, whom Locke tutored, appreciated this point. It may well qualify, he says, of his tutor's essay concerning human understanding, for business and the world as for the sciences and a university. No one has done more towards the recalling of philosophy from barbarity into use and practice of the world, and into the company of the better and politer sort, who might well be ashamed of it in its other dress. No one has opened a better or clearer way to reasoning. The man who rescued philosophy, quote, from barbarity and led her back into the marketplace was no philosopher. He was a man of the street, a man of the people, who clothed the maiden of philosophy in the raiment of common sense and smuggled her into the world so dressed that Englishmen would not be ashamed to be caught courting her. The Englishman of Locke's day, indeed, would not have been seen wooing philosophy unless she had been dressed like a fashionable English lady. Locke performed this service for his contemporaries. In dressing philosophy anew and teaching her a fresh idiom, he made her presentable to Englishmen. But in putting new clothes on her back and new speech in her mouth, Locke handled the delicate maiden of philosophy roughly, and she never recovered from the effects of this transformation. Interesting. Locke made her a popular lady, for he said clearly, with apparent wisdom and authority, what lay unexpressed deep in the hearts and minds of his contemporaries. People were tired of extremes in religion, in politics, in philosophy, and Locke was moderation itself in all fields. People were tired of philosophic bickering, and Locke's deceptive simplicity appealed to both their common sense and their intellectual slothfulness. Locke summed up all those forces which had been struggling through the 17th century. He justified them and enthroned them, and ex post facto, he showed the people of England how moderate, how reasonable, how tolerant they had been in their century of fratricidal struggle. He sounded notes that struck up sympathetic vibrations everywhere. Everything he said seemed so reasonable, so sensible, so fair, because this is what the Whig victors of the glorious revolution thought themselves to be. Locke became their spokesman in all fields, and their children became his disciples. So he told them what they wanted to hear, maybe not for that reason. And I would also suspect that it benefited them. Okay. Locke is important then for having justified the Whig revolution, a nice bloodless coup of which Locke could be proud. But he justified, without ever knowing it, other and bloodier revolutions to come in France and in America. In reacting reasonably against the arbitrary rule of the Stuart kings, Locke preached an individualism in politics, in religion, and in education that would be pushed through the following centuries into an extreme laissez-faire in politics, indifferentism in religion, and chaos in education, which he would certainly condemn. Locke reasonably showed that men are not born with innate ideas, that knowledge is acquired through the senses. But doing this clumsily, he unknowingly opened the way to an environmental determinism which reduced men to the status of passive reeds bending before the breezes of nature. And Locke pushed God further back into his heaven, thus preparing the way for 18th century deism. Deism was what our founders, I think that's what Thomas Jefferson considered himself, where they feel like God created the world, the universe, and then just doesn't get involved. So he didn't save my house, but he did save my house. Working through, yes, the firemen were there, but 10 different things had to come together for that to happen. And that is, I'm going to call that proof of divine intervention. His moderate empiricism, his modified utilitarianism, and his hypothetical materialism were safe enough in his hands and in the hands of the average common sense Englishman. But that was because they were not philosophers. They were content to stop short of the logical conclusions towards which their common sense compromises pointed. Consistent philosophers were to come along, however, to push various Lockean theories to logical conclusions, just the sort of thing that is un-Lockean and un-English. Thus, Locke came to stand at the head of divergent streams of modern philosophy, all of which, in some way, stem back to him and are colored by his distinctive personality. Berkeley, so it's spelled Berkeley, but it's pronounced Barclay, if I'm not mistaken. Someone can sanity check that if you want. Berkeley and Hume could follow him in one direction and get rid of everything except a stream of consciousness, thus ending in full skepticism. Empiricists, positivists, and utilitarians could follow him in another direction and end up denying the validity of speculation, but not of, quote, facts. Voltaire could use Locke as a weapon against established institutions in France and thus make him the godfather of the French Enlightenment and of the French Revolution. This is very much for a mild-mannered bachelor to have accomplished. It seems almost unbelievable that John Locke, who was neither particularly profound nor especially dynamic, could have stamped himself so strongly on the modern mind. Let's find out how. Okay, so now we're in the first section. That was the prologue. But he did. Or perhaps it is truer to say that he was stamped on the modern mind. For it was not so much Locke who made himself great, but rather the times in which he lived and causes for which he wrote that made him famous. Locke lived in troubled times, and it is only by keeping England's troubles in mind that we can understand his various writings. For Locke always addressed himself to practical problems. He never tried to create a systematic philosophy. His only interest was to solve problems bothering himself and other Englishmen. John Locke was born in 1632, the fourth year of Charles I's 11-year tyranny, quote, when Descartes was in Holland pondering his marvelous discovery and writing his Traité du Monde, when parliamentarians and Puritans were murmuring in England, and restlessness was in the air. Locke's parents were typical mid-17th century Puritans, severe, pious, unmerciful, hard. When the Civil War began in 1640, Locke's father joined the parliamentary forces against the king. And when Charles was beheaded 9 years later, young Locke was at Westminster School. During the harsh days of Cromwell's Commonwealth, Locke was a student. I was reading something about Cromwell. There's Oliver Cromwell and I think Thomas Cromwell. I think I was reading Wolf Hall, which I believe is about the other one, Thomas, but this is Oliver, I'm sure. But I was telling my mother, I was reading this great book about Cromwell. Oh, Cromwell. She starts spitting. I guess Oliver Cromwell really screwed over the Irish, and I don't even want to hear it. Don't even tell me about it. So this is those days. Okay. During the harsh days of Cromwell's Commonwealth, Locke was a student at Oxford, where Charles had established his headquarters a decade before. Here he came under diverse influences. The newly appointed dean, John Owen, was a Puritan, but he and most of the Oxford faculty were independent rather than Presbyterian, and they therefore favored rather wide toleration in religion. Locke's favorite professor, however, was Edward Pocock, the most prominent and most outspoken royalist on the faculty. It is certain from what Locke says in later life that he found Oxford a dilapidated palace of learning in these hectic times. He complained that logic, rhetoric, and scholastic metaphysics were badly taught, that it was absurd to use Latin as the medium of speech in the classroom. Against these things and against the strict, tedious religious services he was obliged to attend, he strongly reacted in later life. I'm just thinking, if everybody spoke Latin, yes, they say it separated the common people from the priests, but if all the educated people in all the countries of Europe, if Latin was the lingua franca, they could really communicate. They could share ideas. They could potentially affect best practices. And that could be a threat to the sovereignty of the king rather than the people. So maybe that's one of the reasons that the vernacular was adopted or Latin was pushed out. And the fact that it didn't grow, Latin's a dead language, basically. Uh, you wouldn't have to keep up. Like everybody could just, it would be like a legacy thing. Anyway, I'm just noodling. I don't know if that's true. I don't know. In the days when General Monk was negotiating with Charles II for the Restoration, Locke was appointed lecturer in Greek at the university, and a little later he was offered a lectureship in rhetoric. In 1661, he was given the censorship of moral philosophy at Oxford, a position usually reserved for those preparing for the Anglican ministry. During the next 6 years, however, he was drawn more and more into physical experiments, especially into the study of chemistry and medicine. In 1668, he was made a Fellow of the Royal Society, no mean honor for a young master of 36 in the first heyday of mathematical and scientific discovery. Somewhere along the line, Locke sidestepped ordination into the Anglican ministry, but by royal dispensation he managed to keep his studentship, ordinarily held by those in the ministry. Locke seems to have determined to become a physician instead, but when he first left the academic life of Oxford, he had not yet received his degree in medicine. His first visit to the continent of Europe was in 1665, when he went to Berlin as secretary to Sir Walter Vane, English ambassador to the Elector of Brandenburg. Locke's work as secretary to the ambassador enabled him to accomplish two things. First of all, he made connections with men important in English politics. Second, he learned much of the world in which he now moved for the first time. His letters back home show he was particularly impressed with the religious tolerance practiced in Brandenburg, Prussia. Quote, so this is an example of what I'm talking about. And I know maybe somewhere in the lizard brain of my mind, like my first reading of this book is just still there and communicating with the front of my brain, but I don't remember any of this stuff. And it does seem to be true that he's kind of getting best practices out of interacting with the broader world. The distance in their churches, he wrote of the Prussian people to Robert Boyle, gets not into their homes. They quietly permit one another to choose their way to heaven. For I cannot observe any quarrels or animosities amongst them upon the account of religion. Locke undoubtedly contrasted this latitudinarianism, really? Latitudinarianism with England's strict sectarianism. And I would contrast it with what MacArthur said, and I think maybe Christopher Dawson, who was a Catholic philosopher of the mid-20th century about Europe, sociologist maybe. They both said if a place doesn't have a common religion, it is not working towards a common goal and it is on the decline. Even if it's still increasing in prosperity, it will not last as a culture. MacArthur said that too. Weird. But I guess Germany, well, did Germany last? Well, I mean, it was attacked from without and a fifth column and all that. Upon his return home, he was offered a secretaryship with the ambassador to Spain. But Locke refused the job. He had made the acquaintance of Lord Ashley, the future Shaftesbury, who was a prominent member of the famous Cabal Ministry. That's in quotes. And his destiny was intimately bound up with the Whig leader's affairs for the next 20 years. He became the Ashley family's physician, and the story runs that once he saved Ashley's life by operating on him. He tutored his son and was later given the task of hunting him up a suitable wife. He assisted at the birth of the couple's son, the third Earl of Shaftesbury, whom, in turn, he tutored. Meanwhile, he served as handyman in furthering Shaftesbury's various enterprises. One of these was the administration of Carolina, granted to Shaftesbury and 7 other Lord Proprietors in 1663. Locke became a sort of general secretary and home manager of the colony. He took an important part in drawing up its constitution, into which he worked his views on religious toleration. When Shaftesbury was made Lord High Chancellor, Locke dispensed the Chancellor's ecclesiastical patronage, and when Shaftesbury made his famous speech for war against the Dutch, Locke stood at his side, manuscript in hand, to prompt him if his memory faltered. Oh, demerit for Locke. Bad Locke. In 1673, Locke then 42, was made Secretary of the Board of Trade, an important position carrying the then handsome remuneration of £500 a year. His work on the board shows him methodical in administration and attentive to matters of detail. But shifts of political fortune plus concern for his fragile health caused Locke to give up his work for travel in Europe. For almost 4 years, he lived in France, dividing his sojourn between Montpellier and Paris. Here he spent his time in the company of scientists and physicians, whom he preferred over the philosophers with whom he could have associated. He arrived back in London in 1679, characteristically after Shaftesbury, who had been imprisoned in the Tower for a year, was released and made president of the newly formed council. At this point, political events in England take on a cloak and dagger mystery coloring. Shaftesbury was arrested for high treason on July 2nd, 1681, but he was released on bail. In the summer of 1682, he planned a Whig insurrection, but when the plot was discovered, Shaftesbury escaped to Holland, where he died of gout early in 1683. You can die of gout? Ouch. Gosh. If you have gout, drink cherry juice. Seriously. Locke's role was mysterious and obscure. At any rate, he stayed just out of harm's way. It is not unjust to state that Locke cleverly played both ends against the middle. His part was obscure enough that if the insurrection failed, as it did, he would not be implicated. But if it succeeded, he would come in for preferment as Shaftesbury's trusted man. There was no evidence legally to implicate Locke, but he was suspected on all sides. His, quote, mysterious and highly secret business in these 2 years undoubtedly had something to do with the plot. Prideaux wrote on March 14, 1682, John Locke lives a very cunning and unintelligible life here, being 2 days in town and 3 out, and no one knows where he goes, or when he returns. Certainly there is some Whig intrigue managing, but here not a word of politics come from him, nothing of news or anything else concerning our present affairs, as if he were not at all concerned. When Locke stayed on at Oxford after Shaftesbury's escape to Holland, opponents tried to catch him off guard, but the Dean of Christ Church tells how unsuccessful they were. Although very frequently discourses have been purposely introduced to the disparagement of his master, the Earl of Shaftesbury, his party and designs, he could never be provoked to take any notice or discover in word or look the least concern, so that I believe there is not in the world such a master of taciturnity and passion. Nonetheless, in 1683, Locke, now 51, decided his health would be better in Holland. Where his benefactor is. Anyway, there he retreated and there he remained until the, quote, climate in England had grown healthier for Whigs through the deposition of James II and the installation of William III in the Glorious Revolution of 1688. In Holland, Locke lived carefully, even hiding under an assumed name for a while. Here he associated with literary and scientific leaders of the continent, among whom his closest associate was Philip van Limborch, a leader of the undogmatic, tolerant group of Calvinists in Holland. When he was 54, the age at which Descartes died, Locke published his first article, a contribution to Leclerc's Bibliothèque Universelle, in which he condensed the message he was to give the world 4 years later in his famous essay concerning human understanding. In 1689, after William had safely embellished himself on the English throne, Locke returned to his native land in the same convoy that brought Princess Mary to England. Back at home, Locke enjoyed political preferment. He was a member of the party that had managed the revolution, and he was personally acquainted with both the king and the queen. But he turned down the first several jobs offered to him. He refused to be ambassador to the Elector of Brandenburg because he had reason to apprehend the cold air of the country and because of their warm drinking. Locke knew that the Berliners were hearty drinkers. He thought heavy drinking bad for his health, and he had the good sense to see this as a business handicap. Quote, the knowing what others are doing would be at least one half of my business, and I know no such rack in the world to draw out men's thoughts as a well-managed bottle. Interesting. They do say that people who use vulgarity and people who drink are more honest. But of course, in vino veritas, so it's almost unavoidable. And I always think it's weird how many of the presidents don't drink or don't drink anymore. Bush, I don't know if he ever fell off the wagon, but he was on the wagon, at least in his first term. Trump doesn't drink. Reagan didn't drink. I assume Jimmy Carter didn't drink. I have a hunch Clinton drank. Anyway, Locke became instead Commissioner of Appeals, a job involving little work and paying £200 a year. He held this position, along with other varying ones, for life. Locke is now, wow, that's some jack. Locke is now to be found in and out of various government positions, sometimes administrative and sometimes advisory. It seems certain, for example, that he had a hand in framing the Toleration Bill of 1689, though its provisions, when passed, were less liberal than he wished. But, he wrote to Limborch, revealing a characteristic Lockean attitude, it is something to have got this far. 2 winters in London, combined with intense governmental work and literary activity, were too much for Locke's health. So in the spring of 1691, he went to live with the Mashams of their country home in Essex, Mashams. Here he remained for the last 14 years of his life, dividing time for the first 10 years between London, where he did his government work, and Oates, where he did most of his literary work, and enjoying the companionship of the Masham family and their friends. Upon his return to England, Locke, who had published only a single article in his lifetime, suddenly loosed upon the world a barrage of works in various fields of learning. In 1689, his first, the best, letter on toleration was published. Locke had written this letter to his Dutch friend Limborch. It was published, apparently by Limborch, in Latin in Holland without acknowledgement of authorship. Nonetheless, Locke was provoked, for he feared the censure and the opprobrium it might bring upon him. So he was glad it was anonymous. And the next year he published his 2 most famous and most influential works, the Essay Concerning Human Understanding, which he had labored on from time to time for many years, and the 2 treatises of government, which he probably wrote during his last month in Holland. In the same year of 1690, he published his second Letter on Toleration, following 2 years later by a third. In 1691, followed 2 years later by a third. In 1691, he wrote a long essay on lowering the rate of interest. In 1693, well, I wonder how they set the rate of interest. And I guess this was post interest is okay, which I believe Luther and Calvin contributed to, if I'm not mistaken. In 1693, his Thoughts Concerning Education was published. 2 years later appeared his last important work. I believe it was Calvin who thought it was okay. I don't think Luther thought it was okay, but maybe paved the way. See how quickly we forget the details? His last important work, The Reasonableness of Christianity. Posthumously published works show how wide were his interests and how good was his self-judgment in withholding these pieces from the world. Among these works are such varied things as commentary on some of St. Paul's epistles, a discourse on miracles, observations on the culture of vines and olives, and the constitutions of Carolina. But Locke was not primarily an author. He wrote only to solve a practical problem, such as that of toleration, or to justify a certain line of action, such as that of the Whig Party in the Glorious Revolution. His main work was political, and it always turned out to be both patriotic and at the same time remunerative to Locke. So he was getting paid for it. I'd be curious, maybe he'll tell us who. Yeah. In 1694, for example, he became one of the original proprietors of the Bank of England. A proprietor? Which was pushed through Parliament by the Whigs as a privileged company. So I guess it was protected, like you give it a license. Locke subscribed £500, a large sum in those days, on which he made good profit, I will bet, as Whigs almost always managed to do. In 1696, when The Whigs revived the Council of Trade and Plantations. Locke was made one of the commissioners. At £1,000 a year, and until his resignation 4 years later, he was the council's presiding genius. His work on that council is typical of Locke's philosophy of life. In 1697, when the commission faced the problems of discouraging Irish competition in the woolen industry, it was Locke's scheme which was adopted and which turned Ireland into a nation of flax spinners instead of wool makers. This is the laissez-faire guy? Dang it. Locke's report was also the one accepted by the commission for dealing with the problem of keeping the poor off relief and at work for starvation wages. Each parish was to force its poor to work. Anyone caught begging outside his parish was to be sentenced to 3 years on the ships or at hard labor in a house of correction. For begging? I mean, I don't like it, but I mean, isn't that, I mean, I guess I would call that a form of freedom of speech, but I guess public property has rules. I don't know. Locke retired from public life in 1700 to spend his last 4 years with the Mashams, where he seemed to have been a sort of beloved great uncle as much at home as anyone in the family. He was a cheerful member of the family circle who insisted on paying his way, who was ready with practical advice for younger people, who was especially interested in little children and in young persons he wished to start through life on the right path. He delighted in the company of young men and women, but such a person as the sick old Bishop Fowler only annoyed him, for he complained, "I find two groaning people make but an uncomfortable concert." Careful as he was of his coy mistress, his health, Locke was not a groaner. He was, from all reports of the Mashams, cheerful to the end. He spent the greater part of his literary activity in writing on St. Paul's epistles and on miracles. Biblical exegesis was the subject of many of his conversations in these years. Locke, who always led a virtuous life, was a genuinely religious man in these last 4 years. In his last hours of illness, which he seems to have borne without complaint, he talked much with the Mashams of their eternal concerns. "I heard him say the night before he died," Esther Masham wrote to a mutual acquaintance, "that he heartily thanked God for all his goodness and mercies to him, but above all for his redemption of him by Jesus Christ. He who nursed his health so carefully for 72 years finally died sitting in a chair on October 28, 1704, peacefully, quietly, without struggle or protest. Locke died as he lived. Posterity and circumstance assigned him a greatness he would never have given himself. It is to Locke's credit that he was nearer right than posterity." So he was like justifiably modest and humble. And it is posterity that has exalted him, is what this guy's saying. And I, of course, think it's because what he was saying suited their purposes. Those who were in a position to choose one philosophy or another to be promoted. So let's start. This is part 2. It's just a couple of pages. So now we've kind of got squared away the biography, and let's start with the meatier stuff. Part 2. Descartes, we have seen, always observed men in detached fashion. He was more concerned with philosophy than philosophers. Not so Locke. He studied people endlessly. He came to know them, and he liked them. Locke was especially fond of children, whom he watched at play by the hour, whom he understood, whom he studied as a physician, psychologist, and educator. Whereas Descartes had withdrawn from the world to contemplate truth, then Locke stayed in the world to study man. So this makes me feel like praxeology, Ludwig von Mises' favorite word, I would say, of what we don't care about what should happen. All we care about is what actually happens. And that was the foundation, I think, of his economics, and his magnum opus was called Human Action, Mises. So I'm seeing a lot of the roots of Mises here. He was well equipped, Locke was well equipped temperamentally to make such a study, for certainly he felt what Pope so pithily expressed, "Know then thyself, presume not," excuse me, "Know then thyself, presume not God to scan. The proper study of mankind is man." Locke was a constant, acute observer of this man he proposed to study. His letters from the continent to friends in England show how carefully he studied manners and customs among the French, the Hollanders, and the Germans. His descriptions of church services in France, for example, are photographic, even to noting how the Cardinal Archbishop of Narbonne was, quote, talking every now and then laughing with the bishops next to him. Back in England, he watched girls play dibstones by the hour and figured out painless ways of turning this game into an educational device. He listened to babies cry, and soon he could discourse as learnedly on the meaning of various cries as the superintendent of a nursery can today. His observation was not that of an idly curious person. It was always for a purpose. He used it to give him the factual data from which he could arrive at conclusions in law, in philosophy, in education, or in any of the other social sciences. His travels in France, for example, convinced him that men are moved more by the desire for good repute and fear of disgrace than by anything else. Men are moved more by the desire for good repute and fear of disgrace than by anything else. I think that might be true. That's like consistent with what I use, that tipping is proof of anarcho-capitalism. I almost never got stiffed, and I didn't make a salary. I made tons of money many years ago, and people just would be embarrassed. They just would be embarrassed to not tip. He therefore that would govern the world well, Locke concludes. He, therefore, that would govern the world well, had need consider rather what fashions he makes than what laws. And to bring anything into use, he need only give it reputation. That's actually what Ron Paul said about abortion. He said it wasn't really the law, it was the mindset that changed. This sounds like the observation of a successful advertising executive. Descartes could never have made it. Locke alone of our 11 makers of the modern mind thought such thoughts and said such things. There are 12. I think that's a little typo. His original book must have only had 11. I think he added Dewey. As Locke was uniquely observant for a thinker, so was he philosophically practical. He never tried to do the impossible or the dangerous or even the difficult. Practicality, indeed, was a guiding norm for his reforms. When he could not get the right answer, he was content to get something nearly right. He favored tolerance, for example, because it is impractical to punish dissenters. Interesting. Yeah, I always thought that's why I liked Aristotle better than Plato. Like, you want to empower the person who has the power. You don't want to enforce it from the outside, like guilt over shame. He opposed a scheme to fix the rate of interest at 4%. Again, because he thought that interest could not be fixed by law, and any attempt to do so would only throw the money market into a state of confusion. I think that's fair. He suggested that all gentlemen learn to keep accounts and that they learn one or more trades, all for practical reasons. It can indeed be said of Locke that he pushed practicality so far as always to take the easy way out of any difficulty, whether it was the right way or not. He always managed to find the easy practical solution. I would say a note on interest. His idea, I think, would be that gentlemen would never charge more than 4%. The reason that doesn't work is because of Keynes. Keynes incorporate, or because you lose the gold standard and everything. And once you incorporate inflation into the money supply, then your real interest rate of 4% is going to be some unknown number, because it's going to be your 4% plus the inflation rate. So you're not raised like, no gentleman would spend more than, pay more than 4%. You'd be like, oh, well, the spread on this would be that and blah, blah, blah. And then you have increasing risk. Is it for a purpose of somebody needing the money, or is it for investment purposes? It gets complicated. But his idea, I think it's not a bad idea to have norms like that. But if you read Tragedy and Hope, I think that's where it said a big, like a very effective tool of the power elite is to disconnect generations. You won't have these rules of thumb if the world changes so much. Massive technological changes. I always think birth control pill was the biggest one. I mean, it could be a million things, but that's just one I can think. You can see the social difference. Okay, when various proposals were made in 1700 for bringing the English calendar, then 11 days behind the continental calendar up to date, Locke proposed an easy way, quote, that would gradually slide the English calendar into the Gregorian in 44 years. Again, he insisted that learning should never be a burden. Yeah, good. It should rather be an easy, painless affair accomplished with the least possible effort. But what was isn't it, who said something like, to learn man must suffer, that knowledge falls drop by drop upon the heart, even in sleep, until through the awful grace of God comes wisdom, something like that. I gotta find that. Can someone find that for me, please? Uh, I'll find it. I'll find it at the end. Okay, we're almost finished. Locke was concerned, he tells us, with that way of training up youth with regard to their several conditions, which is the easiest, shortest, and likeliest to produce virtuous, useful, and able men. He developed means whereby children may be cozened into a knowledge of the letters. C-O-Z-E-N-E-D is cozened or cozened? And he always insisted that contrivances, cozened probably like cozy, contrivances might be made to teach children to read whilst they thought they were only playing. Frederick Douglass tricked kids into teaching them how to read in a way like that, I think. Observant, practical, prudent to the point of timidity, Locke was a thoroughly likable man. Unless, like Carlyle, one prefers a world filled with dynamic heroes. He was a kindly man who seems to have preferred playful banter with children to serious discussion with his equals. He was an amiable conversationalist who, from all accounts, had a full stock of humorous stories, which he recounted with finesse. Locke is often called the most English of English philosophers, but he can well be pictured as a typical 19th century American living in 17th century England. He was free of mental worries, as well as we can tell, eminently sociable, and for a philosopher, remarkably even-tempered. And in many little ways, he was typically American. His ordinary drink was water, to which he accounted his long survival and his good eyesight. He was assiduous in taking exercise, especially riding, walking, and gardening. To him, indeed, the development of English athletics as gentlemanly arts is largely due. He thought exercise rather good for gentlemen, and he made it pretty much a class affair. Locke's opinion of himself is worth noting both because it is quite accurate and because it reveals something of his mind. He calls himself, at the height of his fame, a bookish man, but he does not by any means believe that he ranks with Robert Boyle or the incomparable Mr. Newton or any of the great architects of the palace of human knowledge who built in his day. 'Tis ambition enough, he decided, to be employed as an under-laborer in clearing ground a little and removing some of the rubbish that lies in the way of knowledge. After he retired and began to reflect upon his life, Locke came to place an even lower estimate upon his own worth. He was, he decided, a poor, ignorant man, and if I have anything to boast of, it is that I sincerely love and seek truth. On this point he remained firm, almost vehement for Locke, that he was a sincere seeker after truth, the seed plot of all other virtues. But as death came near, Locke became convinced that, hard as he had tried, he had discovered only little snatches of that elusive entity. He summed up an old man's view of himself and of life when, toward the end, he wrote to Anthony Collins, "This life is a scene of vanity that soon passes away and affords no solid satisfaction, but in the consciousness of doing well and in the hope of another life. This is what I say on experience, and what you will find to be true when you come to take up the account." All right, so that concludes the first of two parts on Locke, and I'm sure we'll dig into the nuts and bolts of his influence in the next and final piece of that work on him, that chapter. Hey, JC. So what were we talking about, James, with Millet? Like he's slashing and burning in Argentina. I'm really out of the news, but I just feel like they use libertarians to usher in their austerity, to create a bunch of misery, and then they discredit libertarianism. In the meanwhile, they probably paid off a lot of the debt that the bankers that be wanted, paid down, and then perhaps the reaction will be a whole nother bout of socialism and then more debt, and the cycle begins again. And if you want to talk about the cycle, the Argentina was used as the example, or one of the examples, but as the example of this particular thing in the Creature from Jekyll Island, that what they do is they lend them, they over leverage them, like some reckless president or whatever borrows too much money. They can't pay it back, so they basically default on the debt. It has serious impact on the country, negative economic impact on the country, but they don't forgive the debt. They restructure the debt. So the debt's always waiting. It never goes away. And in that way, they have kind of perpetual debt. But it's Argentina was the example. So we might just, I haven't checked back. I don't have my books, but we could check back and see if it's following that pattern. But in any case, I don't think it's well-meaning situation. Oh, I wanted to look. Did somebody write the thing? Okay, let me see. Here it is. I used to know this by heart. This is a quote by Aeschylus, Aeschylus, a Greek tragedian. Even in our sleep, pain, I think it starts with to learn must suffer. But anyway, he who learns must suffer. But anyway, this starts with even in our sleep, pain which cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart until in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God. Let's see if I have the whole quote. Here it is. Yeah. He who learns must suffer. And even in our sleep, pain that cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart. And in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom to us by the awful grace of God. And you know, it's funny because I'm going to put it up here. Some people get comforted by like nice, cheerful thoughts. I don't. I like the brutal truth. So the best card I got when my son was born with Down syndrome, and people were like, oh, I got one that said like, he looks great. And it was so sincere that I felt good about that. But my aunt wrote me a note and said, our family is no stranger to tragedy. And it really touched me because I thought like, she understands that it's painful and there's no use denying it. But that's why I like this thing. It makes me feel better. Like, he who learns must suffer, and even in our sleep, pain that cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart. And in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom to us by the awful grace of God. It's a good one. Anyway, so that's the end of this. And I think I'm going to hope to get back in the saddle by the end of the month. I would like to be home before I do that. If they just give us the go ahead, I will get in there with, I'll put a mask on, like a real hardcore one, because this is obviously not good. And I'll just scrub it, but I can't get in there until they check it out, mostly because if it costs money to remediate, insurance has to pay for it. So anyway, it's such a delight to be able to have this little break, really get our minds off today, off the real world for a minute. And it's quite interesting. Okay. Thank you so much for being here. This is Monica Perez.